Hello everyone, it's Jake from the Jams and Tea podcast, and I just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone who stuck through us and our impromptu hiatus this year. We're not a big channel, we don't really earn anything from this, it's purely for the joy of it. So when burnout hits, it hits hard, and it hits harder if you were in the hospital. Thankfully, we're back to full speed ahead, and I elected to do something I've been meaning to do a lot more of. Artist discography videos. I love doing videos like this, it's just that they're a bit time-consuming, to be frank. But seeing as it is spooky season, and seeing as one of the biggest album releases of the year is right on the horizon, I figured we were due for one. So let's talk about The Cure, shall we? A gateway band for many a lonely teenager, The Cure are a band that have a hell of a legacy and a catalog that stands up with the best bands out there. While their relevance may have waned in recent years, Robert Smith has remained a captivating musical presence that, even though the band haven't put out an album in 16 years, has stayed in the popular consciousness due to a variety of factors. The 80s aesthetic revival, the general climate of the world being perfect for gloomy music, and enduring pop hits that somehow get the same level of play as bands like Fleetwood Mac still do. Or the appeal they've always held as an alternative jangle pop staple alongside the Smiths or R.E.M. They're also kind of an important band to me personally, as Disintegration was one of the first albums I ever listened to the full length of, alongside Jeff Buckley's Grace. Those are the two albums that basically shaped my musical taste from, 15, 16 years old? God, I'm old. I may be in my 20s now, but my love for this music simply has not waned, and I want to do this video not to just rank these records, but to discuss them, evaluate them, contextualize them, potentially as a guide for people who have yet to take the full plunge, since the Cure buzz is quite wild considering the first two singles for Songs of the Lost World have come out, and they've actually kind of caught on with people. I didn't really expect that to happen, if I'm perfectly honest. And trust me, this is in fact a plunge worth taking, as I'll try to make clear. Even records that don't hold the lofty status of their most recognized great works are worth exploring still. The Cure formed in 1976 in West Sussex in the United Kingdom. The band began as early as its members were in middle school, and the lineup changed for a few years as the band evolved into a proper musical act, ultimately settling on the more definitive lineup for their first record as being lead vocalist and guitarist Robert Smith, Michael Dempsey on the bass, and Lol Tolhurst on drums. They would go through several phases and lineup changes after this that are very relevant to each album's identity, but the person steering this ship has always more or less been Smith. Known for his gorgeous melodious voice and occasionally frantic, wild guitar playing, the aesthetic of this band has gone on to be one of the guiding cultural signifiers of the goth aesthetic, both visually and musically, and as such, their influence extends to comics, films, fashion, and naturally, music. From bands with sharp retro aesthetics like The Horrors, Churches, or even one of our channel's favorite underappreciated post-punk visionaries, The Twilight Sad, the stretch of this band's influence is incalculably vast. That said, how did they become so popular? What exactly about them made them endure like this? And how the hell does a 50-year-old band manage to set the music corners of the internet aflame for their first album in more than 15 years? Well, let's take a look at this music and see if we can extrapolate a little bit, shall we? Without further ado. Kicking off this list, we're starting with the most recent record in the Cure discography, 2008's 413 Dream. Now, for those uninitiated, I'm not delivering a hot take by saying this is their weakest record. The Cure have quite a few oddball and black sheep albums, and seeing how this band have sustained their popularity through their enduring music, you can find Cure fans who will stick up for just about every single one of them. That said, 413 Dream is the album I have seen the least love for, so why is that exactly? Late Era Cure is tough, because it's by far the phase of their career that's the most inconsistent, but also the most stylistically bold as well. So is this just a matter of this record being a little too out there, like stuff on Wild Mood Swings, for example? On the surface, the cloudy textures, Robert's ageless voice, and the poppier song structures should put this right at home with people ready to receive their radio-ready sound. And frankly, I get what the band was going for here. If only the production could have compensated for that vision accordingly. The Cure are no strangers to flexing just how malleable they can make their sound, as they have vibrant, spacey, maximalist albums like Disintegration and claustrophobic, dense, impactful records like Pornography or Faith. The issue here is simply that the means by which they achieve this sound is by compressing the ever-loving hell out of these instrumentals. If you don't have an ear for production, this may work for you better than most, or at least better than it works for me, but I would be lying if I said that was the end of my limitation here. 413 Dream takes on a writing style that I can only really label saccharine in hindsight, and I know that might sound blasphemous to say about a Cure album, but believe me, I have nothing but exceptional things to say about Robert's songwriting on basically every other album they've ever made. He's fantastic at painting in broad strokes and then complicating those broad strokes to be really, really nuanced. Now, it's wonderful to see Robert, who's struggled for a long time with depression and drug addiction, in a place where he doesn't have to wallow in the worst parts of himself in order to make music. I won't lie and say it isn't endearing to hear how many lovely odes he has to his wife on here. Premier wife guy, apparently, Robert Smith. But it does have a very slight appeal with me personally. Robert's just gotten so good over the years at burrowing into feelings of juvenile insecurity and loneliness that his writing to those subjects always has a dimension to it. Here it's more of a very frank expression of love, but it lacks the ways in which Robert would often muddy the waters or make his examinations of depression so complex and so achingly human. This is less an issue with the record and more my issue, granted, but it still leaves me with very little that I actually want to revisit. Some of these songs are a little half-formed or progress too linearly for my liking, so it's got an odd pace to it as well, and it's got a flow that really does it no favors either. To me, it's the only album from this band that I don't really possess any kind of fondness for. But since it does rely on enough older strengths of the band, I can't find it in me to feel much disdain for it either. A remaster could one day absolve it of a few issues, but there are more fundamental problems it has that I feel are a bit inescapable. It's unfortunate because there is something here. It just feels as though you get far less effort than you put into it if you're really trying to critique it meaningfully. It's the only time when the Cure sound like they're a band imitating the Cure rather than the band proper. A rare case in which a band's worst record is less actively bad and just more their least interesting. And as a result, I don't really have too much to say about it. If you feel differently though, I'd love to hear a defense of it, but judging by its popularity and poor reception, I'm not gonna hold my breath. When it comes to oddball records, I don't think you'll find many albums under the umbrella of a band this big that are this virtually unknown. It's not necessarily because the album was bad per se, it was actually received mostly positively at the time as a stylistic departure from previous records. However, The Cure would go on to make risks like this further down the line, and honestly, the results in mixed bag affairs like Wild Mood Swings are a bit more preferable to this, to me. The leaps forward feel really more like baby steps away from their previous sound because of the loss of one of the founding members of the band. I also think it's fair to say that Robert was being spread thin at this point. After the previous record, Robert actually joined a supergroup with two members of Susie and the Banshees to make an album called Blue Sunshine, which leaned heavily into psych rock. After this, Smith actually served as the guitarist for Susie for a while. And while this occurred, Robert wrote the songs for the top. The result of these circumstances is an album that nobody really thinks much of, but honestly, I do see it as having admirable qualities. Firstly, this feels like the first attempt to branch outward from The Cure's more confident outings into something that eventually would resemble The Cure's signature sound. But the psych rock influences from Blue Sunshine are actually felt here rather strongly. The added incorporation of stringed instruments like violins and fiddles does occasionally add a bit of flavor to the mix. The trouble is that these songs tend to be quite indicative of the focus of the man who penned them, who, at least at the time, had his fingers in perhaps one too many creative pies. That is a dreadful saying. Why did I use that? But there is something kind of off about this record, and if I had to isolate it down to one thing, it's the lack of solid song structure. Sure, you have some mildly beloved hits that Cure superfans such as myself are aware of, like The Caterpillar or the opener Shake the Dog Shake. That said, you also have flimsy experiments like Banana Fishbones or Give Me It, and even an outright bore in the form of The Empty World. And when you take into account that this is only 10 tracks long, the cracks in the facade tend to manifest quite evidently. It occupies a tragic middle ground between too weird to fit in with the established sound of the band, but not weird enough to be considered novel in a more singular sense. Some could refer to this as more of a solo Robert effort, and while not totally unfair, I still think the contributions of Tolhurst can be felt here. And the new drummer Andy Anderson displays his skill confidently enough, but I really can't fault a lot of people for skipping this one. Save this one for later if you explore their career, as it is worth it, and granted, I do think a not insubstantial amount of people ride for this one a bit harder than me, but in my eyes, this is a bit of a mess. And you know what? Cool. We love mess. And the Cure are great at making messes work very often. But this is probably the only case in this discography where that aforementioned messiness does not yield them many favors. This will undoubtedly be the first placement on this list bound to upset people, particularly longtime Cure fans who love their early era post-punk. I think it's generally accepted that their sophomore album is an improvement in most ways, but I won't lie, I gotta challenge the consensus here and say that I unfortunately deem this to be less of an empirical leap forward and more of a lateral move, all things considered. However, this doesn't mean there isn't plenty to love about 17 Seconds. From the moment the first proper song, Play for Today, starts, you hear the blistering enormity of both Simon Gallup's muscular bass lines that feel like being hit with a blunt object, to Tolhurst's drums, which are positively cavernous. It is absolutely a clear leap forward in sound and production. There's a grim murkiness on this album that just simply wasn't there before. So in a lot of respects, this record is one of the most pivotal when it comes to studying the band's stylistic evolution. I guess my main issue here is that a lot of these improvements are made for an album that feels decidedly subtle, which is fine, for the record, but there's a lack of complete synergy here that just wasn't an issue beforehand. I think this is a highly transitional record, and they more or less perfect this formula in the release that followed, as some of these songs feel like they were constructed in tandem with a sound that emphasizes the hollowness of everything here. That's not an inherently bad thing, especially for 80s post-punk. The Cure are clearly cribbing some notes from the first Joy Division album that came out the year prior. However, in making something stylistically consistent, there's a lot of this that feels relatively tame, and in moments, kind of skeletal. This approach may work for you if you are explicitly looking for it, but this doesn't hold a whole lot of appeal as a Cure record to me. Even though they cover lots of different stylistic variances over the years, this manages to occupy a weird middle ground where it doesn't fully inhabit any one of their strengths, and just kind of does everything pretty well. Both the morose tragedy of Faith and the vibrancy of everything they made post-Pornography are things I only get glimpses of in this album. This is less an example of finding substantive critique with something, and more it just occupying a weird place for me personally. That's not to imply this is a flat line. Nothing could be further from the truth. I just have to accentuate why it's placed here. Songs like Play for Today and the immaculately spacious and beloved A Forest have earned their place in the band's long narrative arc. In fact, if I can meet everyone in the middle here, while I wouldn't call anything here a complete whiff, though the opener doesn't do a lot for me, nor do the songs like Secrets for their aforementioned skeletal nature, aside from the marginally pointless The Final Sound, everything past this is fucking fantastic. The run of A Forest through the title track is perhaps their crowning achievement of their first two records. This is actually an instance where I'd love to hear from people who like this a great deal more than me, because I must admit it is a difficult album to wrap my head around when it comes to its appeal. There is an abundance of greatness here, but when the writing doesn't exactly feel as though it makes the same leaps as the production, it's something that sadly feels rendered less significant than what surrounds it, in my eyes. Often is the case when the commercial peak of a band ends, they pivot in some direction or another that ultimately aligns with their waning relevance. And the end result is an album that gets entirely too much shit from its core audience and doesn't sell well beyond that. I won't sit here and say that the aptly named Wild Mood Swings is one of their best records, but what it is instead of this is an excellent showcase of versatility. As we move into a more liminal place for the band after another key member departure, it becomes more and more difficult to solidify a consensus because of so many various factors here. So color me surprised that when I revisited this, not only did it grow on me, I was enamored with how bold it was. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of Cureisms here, songs about being lovelorn and heartbroken, albeit with a twist. Put a pen in that. But it also has, like, flamenco guitar and borderline dance pop on this thing. In that respect, the frequently manic wish that preceded this actually makes for a progression that makes at least a little bit of coherent sense, as this is like if you took songs like Wendy Time or Doing the Unstuck and made an entire album out of them. It really leans in on Robert's most eccentric tendencies as a performer, and the band actually does keep pace with it. Nothing about this is cohesive, but you know what it is? Fun as hell. It feels as though Robert and the band are operating with zero limitations and complete freedom, and that has a ceiling, I admit. But frankly, this album single-handedly proves that the band are incredibly well-rounded and are far more than just being a mopey band for entry-level mall goths, as they can often be described. So if I'm so enthusiastic about this, why is this on the lower end of the list? Well, that reckless abandon they attack this album with is a double-edged sword. With 14 tracks and 61 minutes, this is an album that whips you about so much that it starts to feel like beyond the malleability of the style, there's not a lot here that's going to engage you as consistently or as emotionally as other records, and I won't lie, that is a lot of the core appeal of The Cure for me. It's kind of an impossible task to make this all gel together in a way that makes sense, so it's best to just not try, lest you end up with a bunch of half measures. And Wild Mood Swings is anything but that. And for that reason, I respect it. So, with all that said, if the writing frequently doesn't play to their strengths, what exactly does it do? Well, that's the thing. Robert on here is, he's horny. He's really, really horny. Like, Jesus, dude, have some decorum. I'm far from a prude, but this album has a lot of sexual content that just doesn't really work for me. It's not awful or anything, but it starts to feel like white noise that threatens to drown out the far more interesting music and performances. Wild Mood Swings is the dictionary definition of a mixed bag. I feel like anyone will tell you that. But it's up to the listener to find out what it is that works and what it is that doesn't, because too much about this is too eclectic for anyone to call any shots before they actually hear it. If you haven't heard this or didn't like it originally, keep an open mind. Give it another shot. The one that started it all. It's very funny and mildly inspirational to think this incredibly modest three-piece band who dabble in new wave, pop, and some classic post-punk would ultimately graduate into one of the most beloved bands in all of music. When revisiting this, I found it kind of shocking how much The Cure leaned into the punk of post-punk. Even further surprising, this album and London Calling dropped the exact same year, and while a far cry from the unabashed confidence of that band's third outing, I see a lot of flair that was far more indicative of a straight-up punk spirit. Combined with the fact that all these songs are very tightly structured, contain a lot of fascinating rhythmic ideas, and a unique presence of a younger, wilder Robert Smith, this actually feels like it presages their work on the Head on the Door, a direction that, after years of expanding their sound, I don't think was an entirely obvious sound for them to revisit. It makes this album feel both novel and essential to this band's DNA. Frankly, if you dig groovier post-punk, the dance pop and new wave vibe of this record may hold simpler, sweeter appeal for you. Without a doubt in my mind, I think this is their most accessible record on basically every front. And while not even mostly indicative of where they'd go, I still think that you can trace the origins of stuff like Wish or Wild Mood Swings right back to this. It is a bit slight, but seeing as The Cure only operates in two extremes, sub 40-minute records and records that eclipse an hour, this was definitely the right move to make when starting out. The real core secret weapon at the core of this album is one of the band's most undervalued strengths as pop musicians, that being the art of writing and delivering hooks. They are here, they are plenty, and they are catchy. And it adds to a relentless pace that lets you really move with the music as it progresses. This is far from the most confident outing in the world, as it becomes more and more obvious that this album is partially the way it is because it's still the nascent stage of the band, and partially because the label selected the songs and the sequencing of the album for the band. While this was effective at getting their name out there, somewhat, Robert was at least promised that after that record, the band would have full creative control after their launching off point. So I guess in a lot of ways, the sudden shift to a more cold, glacial feeling record as soon as the very next year actually makes a whole lot of sense. While this lacks unity and coherent vision, it wins me over for the fun factor, which reminds me heavily of the first record from Talking Heads. just with less anxiety and more prosaic lyricism. This is certainly an odd duck, and I could see anybody having any opinion on it, but from where I sit, this is unique enough to stand out without feeling totally separate from everything else. If you haven't given this a look yet because of its very obvious aesthetic differences, I advise you to give it a shot. Not by any means life-changing, but a hell of a lot of fun. While not the first or last curveball in this ranking, I bet a number of you were confused when number 12 was not immediately preceded by The Cure's self-titled record, as it's generally accepted that the most recent two records from the band are the least essential. But frankly, after finding myself not moved much by 413 Dream, I actually had the opposite reaction to this record. Frankly, it's not hard to see why it was maligned from the outset. After the return to form of Bloodflowers, the band sort of had carte blanche to go wherever they wanted to, and thus Robert and company recruited legendary post-hardcore producer Ross Robinson, who was well known at this point for working with bands like Glassjaw, At the Drive-In, and Slipknot. For whatever that's worth, three of this podcast's favorite post-hardcore acts. As such, it's a bit of a change of palette for the band, as these songs don't billow and sway as much as the material on their previous record, instead opting for an approach that was more direct, hard-hitting, and even kind of mangled. There's a refreshing, stripped-back simplicity to this album's sound that I feel actually complements the material quite well. As strange of a combination as this is, I think Robert's ageless voice actually slots into this in a way that feels borderline ahead of its time. I was frequently reminded of bands like Shoo Shoo or even later Nine Inch Nails records, and I think you're starting to see the problem here. The Cure had more or less mastered the art of radio pop accessibility by this point, and the commercial success of their biggest albums were in fact behind them. So the world at large had a very narrow idea of what a Cure album was and could be. The end result is something that, as a fan of modern alternative music, I deeply appreciate for its uniqueness. For those who wanted a Cure album that captured the blissful sorrow of Disintegration or the brighter, still more lovesick Wish, yeah, it makes sense why they'd be disappointed. Similarly, it's not like this is an album that, when you take away the more unique style, can appeal to the new metal and industrial rock fans of the mid to late 2000s. Simply put, there was simply no audience for this record to resonate with. Now? The fact that the content here lyrically is basically very par for course when it comes to their albums serves as an anchor to explore a unique, heavier, angstier sentiment and sound. I would say that Smith gives an array of his best, most frequently unhinged performances on songs like Us or Them. Hell, the songs themselves are just no slouch either. I would say that Lost and The Promise are two of the band's best songs, period. You have to be willing to meet this one halfway a little bit. I admit that. Don't expect it to scratch the itch of a heavier release, and don't expect a traditional Cure record. And you may see the vision that is often much more than the sum of its parts. Once upon a time, I considered The Head on the Door to be my favorite Cure album. Obviously I don't anymore, hence the ranking, but there's so much about it that's alluring that I completely understand why my attachment to it was so strong back in the day. The Cure basically dabbled in every variety of post-punk that there was. The Head on the Door belonging to the more eccentric, almost art rock adjacent stuff you'd find from bands like Talking Heads and the work of Robert Fripp. The result makes this a tight, concentrated affair focused on groove and momentum more than anything else. It's also an accessible entry in the tonal department, if nothing else, as this is a much less dreary album than a lot of their previous work. It's just more colorful and occasionally even fun, almost. This is where we see Robert finally fully embracing his weirdo shit in a way that remains musically satisfying. Thankfully, this Fripp derivative work also has a litany of fantastic moments on guitar that finally flirt with a jangle pop sound that would ultimately develop into the sound we'd know from their first hits. All this said, we're beginning to approach the issue I have with this album, that being the unenviable status it has as being stylistically transitional. The top before this tends to be stuck with that label, but I would argue that was more of a case of being stylistically unsuccessful rather than outright transitional. It means that this album contains a little bit of everything that The Cure would ever and had ever done, and also doesn't hugely excel at these things. Seeing as it's a little bit more out there, it means that this should, in theory, be a fantastic way to get into the band, but I would say so only with the true caveat being that you should probably be into those aforementioned bands like Talking Heads and even REM first to get everything out of this record. It does contain a few more pop-centric hits that still firmly make it radio-ready in the broadest possible sense of the word, but it's also an album that is very utterly unconcerned with its own flow, bouncing back and forth from idea to idea. And yes, it's a lot less overwhelming than some of the albums that go over an hour in this discography. However, I still can't deny and say that I miss the unity of other more acclaimed albums in this band's canon. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, even though that mixed bag strongly favors positivity. And hey, there's a solid chance that most Cure fans might just dig this one more than I do. It was poppy and fun and bright when I was younger, so of course it captured my attention. But nowadays I find myself drifting towards stuff that's, less immediate and just more outright challenging. And this album does kind of feel like a couple half measures away from being a fully blown, eccentric piece of work. It's just a hair short of that, which is its real only weakness for me. This entry on the list is a bit, wonky. Normally when making a list like this, compilations are a tricky bastard. However, because I included things like the Cocteau Twins' Spangle Maker compilation in the video I did for them, as well as Ballers, Brawlers, and Bastards for Tom Waits, I do think I have to make an exception when a band has a release in a more secondary format that I still deem imperative listening. Connecting the Dots is, in fact, a B-sides record, an absolutely gargantuan one at that, spanning basically every phase of the band's career from the start right up until the turn of the millennium. They may be a band with 3 or 4 albums that really threaten to suffer from a bit of bloat, but this record stands a testament to their creative process because of just how essential these cuts feel. Any superfan is going to tell you that the vast majority of this mammoth 70-song monster is required listening, so here I am, doing that. The reason it ranks in the middle here is mainly because this obviously isn't a singular, more well-groomed record that doesn't much hold together as a statement per se. Definitely an experience you should only try once you've heard every record in this discography, lest you overwhelm yourself, but legitimately, this has to be one of the greatest B-sides albums ever put together. Right up there with Modest Mouse Building Nothing Out of Something or the aforementioned Ballers, Brawlers, and Bastards. There's not a lot to go into depth-wise, since this is such a plethora of songs and eras and band members, so there's no real consistency here. But that's kind of the ultimate charm of throwing this together. Through combining all these things, we get the grandest testament to their enduring stylistic versatility. A definite must-listen, but maybe break up those listens a little bit per each disc, lest you completely overwhelm yourself. I'm just gonna call this album Kiss Me for posterity. Saying it 3 times is a mouthful that just sounds exceptionally fucking silly. That aside, Kiss Me here was technically not a double album when released, but has every trademark of the double album masterpiece phenomenon. I think part of the reason why Wild Mood Swings was so coldly received is that spiritually this album is a much more successful version of that. While not quite as out there, the band still played to their strengths while still injecting a lot of color that made this massive thing feel both unified and risky. At 74 minutes and 18 songs, it's fair to see that after The Head on the Door, the band were ready to anchor themselves and push themselves as far as they could go when it came to cementing their style. Every subgenre of Cure song is here, and frankly, that is the exact kind of spirit you want from something like this. Something with seemingly no limitations, but also doesn't completely get away from you. Alongside another entry further up on this list, Smith has actually stated that these were the albums that he most enjoyed working on. And honestly, one of the most underrated things about this band is how the music perfectly mirrors their narrative as musicians. This absolutely sounds like a record that was fun to make, albeit challenging due to the sheer instrumental variety on here, no doubt. This is a cavalcade of diversity when it comes to musical palettes. And that does have its limitations, but Kiss Me manages to hold together. Even if, yes, it is a bit exhausting to listen to, but since it leans more towards a Cure-like sound, it's just more successful. From classics like Just Like Heaven that retain being catchy and musically invigorating with its wonderful chord choices to the more brooding, more sinister cuts like If Only Tonight We Could Sleep, that are as instrumentally out there as they'd ever get. and basically everything in between those two things. This is an album that's often forgotten when talking about songs that go beyond the singles, but it's a grab bag of fantastic songs. That grab bag, however, is full of stranger, more adventurous deep cuts, so I think that starting here might be unwise if you're not geared up properly. For as many mixed tones as this contains, on the whole it may be the sunniest thing that they have in their discography, or perhaps maybe the most irreverent. That irreverence is simultaneously a big strength and a limitation though, because while the songwriting is engaging, I can't really say that I'm as emotionally invested with this record as I am with other canonical entries, more or less because it feels like that wasn't exactly the priority. After Pornography, I can hardly blame them for dialing it back a little. You'll definitely have your limitations with this one, depending on a variety of factors, but its quasi-beloved status was earned for a very good reason. The lovable underdog of the Cure catalog, I've always had a fondness for Faith. While it's arguable that this Nation record sounds a bit more like Joy Division than anything else, Faith is nonetheless a fantastically morose, cloudy record filled with an existential longing and the experience of being an outsider. While Smith's lamentations on other records are often sincere to a blinding extent, a lot of the tone here is more sinister, more cold, which tracks when you consider just where the band were headed. As one of the up-and-coming British post-punk bands, the touring schedule they had for this phase of their career was obscene, and frankly, you can kinda hear that bleeding into Robert's lyrics on here. For lack of a better way of putting it, he sounds very over it all, with thinly veiled sentiments of resentment permeating the entire record, especially on songs like The Holy Hour, starting with that sick, sour bass line that's groovy as hell, but still kinda stilted. Everything here sounds like it's perverted in some way, yet still there are moments that I think will give traditional fans what they ask for, like the delightfully somber? The Funeral Party, a song that I, to this day, have trouble deciphering the tone of. Robert's longing performance here feels like it's taken from a record they'd make 10 or so years down the line, so you can see his voice burgeoning a bit here from Gallup and Tolhurst. It gives the album a nice identity and a frigid, unforgiving quality to it that fluctuates between the ramblings of a heartbroken outcast and a frighteningly poetic description of pure sensation on songs like the utterly unforgiving The Drowning Man, where Robert prosaically ponders details about a woman drowning in exhaustive detail. The title of the song deriving from the final lyric detailing that her death seems to be modeled after that of another departed soul, implying something potentially cyclical about the sadness found in this drowning woman, and something that feels so inescapable about the depression that really does foreshadow the direction that they end up going after this. I would also be remiss not to mention the rare, once tape-exclusive track Carnage Visors, the instrumental piece that accompanied a short film made by Simon Gallup's brother Rick. It was later put on a CD remaster of the record, and if you already dig this album's vibe, I cannot commend this piece enough, as it's a mammoth 28 minutes that's full of hypnotic, swirling, repetitive instrumentals that do actually feel like a more apt end to the record to me, not delivering a resolution in its naughtiness and lack of lyricism. Seeing as Faith is a scant 36 minutes to begin with in its original form, it's not too patience-trying if you want to add in that little bonus. For those into the more colorful and emotive side of The Cure that you're more used to, that hasn't quite burgeoned yet, but to me, all that does is prove that the diverse catalog here has something for everyone and for every mood, as long as that mood isn't happiness. Even longtime Cure fans jumped ship after Wish, and as the band progressed beyond that after changing gears for the third time, basically everything after Wild Mood Swings is just written off as being records from a legacy act that aren't nearly what they used to be. Naturally, I disagree with this because of my defense of the self-titled, but my real objection exists because Bloodflowers exists. Y'all have got to stop sleeping on this one. I'll give credit where it's due. When it comes to discussing this band online and the resurgence of fans they got due to the omnipresence of lingering cultural ephemera from that time, it seems like people are finally discovering just how goddamn great this is. The Cure's aesthetically sloppy visual style when it comes to their album covers also probably played a factor here because, I mean, yeesh. It's fitting, don't get me wrong, but I defy you to tell me that people in a pre-internet age were all that incentivized to buy this. This is all the more exacerbated when you take into account that this album has no official singles. 2 songs did appear for promotional material, but Smith fought against the record label purely to create something singular, something that didn't compromise for the radio. So, what does make this appealing exactly, and what is it? I mean, The Cure are like debatably the best singles band of all time, so abandoning such an integral part of what they're beloved for was a hell of a risk. To put it bluntly, Bloodflowers is The Cure's psychedelic rock album. Only one song here is short of 5 minutes, yet somehow this album is paced wonderfully, clocking in at under an hour. Besides, these songs are meant to spiral outward, to blossom into waves of psychedelic post-rock, underscored by Robert's incredible sounding voice. The opener, Out of This World, is an immaculate tone setter. A phased guitar gently caresses the background of the song. Every instrument sounds sour and warped, but never unpleasant or ugly. It's the soundtrack to a lovelorn daydream where Robert talks in detail about the tragedy of mortality when contextualized by love. That love has to end when one of you do. But Robert revels in the now, the exquisite moments of happiness that you have to latch on to. It's actually kind of touching, and still shows growth from Disintegration that I find really satisfying. You can see this very exact song conceit used in songs like Jason Isbell's If We Were Vampires, which I say not to connect the two, but to show you how much more songwriterly this affair and late era The Cure often can be. He's always been great at weaving complex narratives, but Robert always felt as though he had to really reach for that. Whereas here, everything is natural. It comes with age, so it stands to reason he'd just be better at it now. The best part about all of this is that Smith has gone on record to say that Bloodflowers was the album he enjoyed making the most out of his career, and that he's immensely satisfied with it. This confidence absolutely shows through, and honestly, what can I say other than this being a quintessential example of something that was ahead of the curve and suffered for it? I mean, for God's sake, what better time could there have been to release a song like Watching Me Fall as a potential single? It's the absolute closest this band have come to full-on shoegaze, and I'd be willing to bet the new guard of the 90s like MBV or Slowdive would have had immense overlap when it comes to their fans, as this is full-on shoegaze now. And that's not the only weird little influence just thrown in there. There's also a lot of influence from the Manchester scene that I find pops up here, as the danceable vibe is still not completely abandoned yet. When it comes to the art of guitar playing, I think there's no better showcase for this element of the band's sound. They roar with an intensity, but they never overwhelm anything else, but they still sound distant, so it kind of feels like you're in the direct eye of a hurricane, the peace within a torrent of ferocity. The coolest thing about all this, too, is that Bloodflowers is one of the Cure albums I've listened to the least, but grows on me with every listen, so in a few years from now, I might even anticipate this jumping up a few spots. Real ones have always known. So if this sounds appealing to you, and frankly it should, seeing as how they balance immediacy and atmosphere so adeptly on here, but it's time we all board the train for Bloodflowers, as it is nothing less than intoxicating. If you want a good sample, start with Watching Me Fall, which may be on the longer side, but trust me, it is a hell of an investment just to hear the soaring heights of Robert's vocal performance on here. One more wrinkle in this album's lore is that there was another version of the record with a bonus track put right in the middle of the track list, coming up, which, if you haven't heard it, fix that. Possibly the heaviest and most industrial The Cure have ever sounded, and by God is it mesmerizing to listen to. Robert's at full throttle against the drums that sound like they could crack skulls on here. There's a lot of reasons why this record fell by the wayside, but now I think it is our job as Cure fans to usher this into the highest possible pantheon of their music, because yes, it is simply that good. The record that definitively ends the first era of the band, Pornography, is, to put it bluntly, the most gothic record The Cure have. From the album cover alone, you can tell the end product you're about to get is going to be feverish, hazy, distorted, and nightmarish. Once the opener, the genuinely harrowing 100 Years, greets you with distant, gated, hollow drums and a roaringly loud guitar line that immediately feels like you're being soaked in dread, you know exactly what this experience is going to hold in store for you. Hint, it's not fun. Before this record, The Cure were the kind of gothic music that veered more explicitly gloomy than outright aggro like they are here. These songs retain the taut precision and muscularity of Faith, with the added spice of production that is all about impact. This is less an album that traditionally feels like what we now know the band to be, and more just a particularly psychedelic spin on bands like Bauhaus or The Chameleons. The swirl of anxieties that make up the lyrics on 100 Years are urgent in a way this band have not been yet. And the production on the vocals makes it sound as though Robert is colorfully, helplessly being tossed around by his own psyche. The impact isn't relegated to just the opener either. We have other beloved cuts here, like The Hanging Garden, which has some utterly insistent, pummeling drum fills that feel genuinely like they belong in a math rock song, or like a shoo-shoo track. This song is less about any one thing, and is more an excuse for Robert to spill imagery at the listener that feels grotesque and ominous. And with a performance that finally lets him truly arrive as a performer, Smith's melodious croon is one of the band's greatest weapons, but I would argue that before this idea had truly cemented itself in their music, it was certainly a bit more dynamic than other disaffected gothic affectations. But here there's color, vibrancy, and pain in his voice that leaps out at you and doesn't let you go. This all makes an alarming amount of sense when you consider why this was the moment this phase of the band ended, as it was fueled by dysfunction that had them on the brink of collapse. Horrible depression Smith was experiencing at the time, and just some really unhealthy drug use on the band's part. Bassist Simon Gallup would actually depart after this, and The Cure move in a variety of directions afterwards, so Pornography really does feel like a special, singular watershed moment that captures the fraught intensity of a band that doesn't know how much time they have left, both in the spotlight or in this world in general. That may sound a bit overly dramatic, but, well, first, look at the band we're talking about here. But also, in the words of Robert himself, his options were to take his own life and give in, or putting what he felt into a record. And all I can say is thank whatever deity you believe in, Smith chose the latter. This relative departure also comes with a change-up of producers from the last two albums, so really I can only applaud these gentlemen for being able to work with one another to the extent that they did, that they harnessed their drive as potently as they do here. It's a damn good thing this album is one of their leaner records too, as this would simply be too much to handle if things like the admittedly excellent B-sides were left on the core album. This is one of those cosmic miracles where everything could have and perhaps even should have gone wrong, and instead, the stars just kind of align, and, as they put it, they make a record that sounds like Phil Spector in hell. Is that ironic? I'm not sure. While a lofty-sounding goal, I think they succeeded. And the best compliment I can afford it is that it is a record that sounds like as though every ounce of blood, sweat, and tears that went into it shows up in the final product. Singular, haunting, tragic, whatever you want to call it, it's a masterpiece. And if not for the challenging content, I would tell you that this is actually a great record to check out first if you want to dispel your illusions that The Cure are just the Friday I'm in Love and Pictures of You band. For all intents and purposes, even with a body of work as great as The Cure, Disintegration can be singled out and confidently labeled as the definitive statement from the band. When looking at lists of greatest albums of all time, this is the record that makes those lists. And somehow, against all odds, despite this being an album that revels in myopic angst, it's garnered such an incredible amount of respect as a canonical goth staple, a high point in the post-punk and dream pop wave of the 80s. And even a surprisingly resonant and enduring record that still speaks to disaffected, lonely teenagers to this very day. It was one of the first albums I ever remember listening to once seeking out the greater musical pantheon, from all-timer hits like Love Song and the absolutely immortal Pictures of You, to its more challenging post-rock and ethereal wave-influenced cuts that extend beyond these song lengths, and further into an uncharted territory that the band had never explored before. If there is one word I would use to describe Disintegration, it's indulgent. And I don't mean that in a bad way at all. As I've grown older, I do find that this record, in its totality, suffers from the weight of its runtime just a tiny bit. I do feel the length of this like I do with Kiss Me, but the single songs here are mostly just too untouchable to suggest shortening or cutting them from the track list at all. When you couple the length with the very heavy, very melodramatic content, it is simply an album that is best enjoyed when you're 17. Sobbing your eyes out after your first heartbreak, and it doesn't matter how long albums are. In that respect, it's kind of a flaw that I admire, because it still is committed to its adolescent yearning. I might come across as though I'm sounding like I may not love the writing on this album, but honestly, that really couldn't be further from the truth. It's simply that this record is so adept at harnessing what it feels like to be young, to feel empty, lost, broken, or totally unworthy of any love you may desire, it immediately sends you right back to that headspace. Now that I'm older, I do find it difficult to revisit this in its entirety because of that aforementioned headspace. Because frankly, it sucks to be there. And I've been there before. Many times. Maybe I even have a vacation home there. I don't know where this is going. However, my love and appreciation for Disintegration hasn't lessened at all. It's really more like it's been reprioritized. It's easier to appreciate this for the fabulous work of musical artistry and atmosphere that it is now. This is the biggest and most lavish that The Cure have ever sounded, shimmering and sparkling with creative flourishes of sound and waves of oppressive, dark atmosphere that set the stage for all Gothic music to come. From the moment the immaculate opener, the ironically titled Plain Song, begins with these subtle wind chimes and ultimately explodes with a crescendo that feels like a galaxy bursting apart, and that size is never let up on. The post-punk is still found in its more immediate moments, but this is simply more ethereal, yet never inhuman. Robert's writing on here may be relatable to a very specific experience, but his vulnerability, on the other hand, that's universal. He taps into longing in ways that are so complex on songs like Homesick or the eternally tragic opener where Robert imagines a cold, dying world where he and the object of his affections are worn, tired, old, and clinging to each other as though none of the darkness in his words or the situation itself matter at all. For all the grandeur and omnipresent sadness, there's still a lot of tonal diversity all over this thing instrumentally and lyrically. The fiery guitars on Last Dance, the anxious, plucked strings that echo the helplessness of a song like Lullaby, the waves of resonating ambience on the damn near Springsteenian Fascination Street. This album is simply the best possible version of itself, and the ultimate cementing of the band's growth as their sound blossoms into this collage of darkness. It's a record where beautiful simply is not enough. There's so much elegance to the craft here that I can only call the consensus of this being one of the band's best being not just deserved, but kind of obvious, frankly. That said, I kind of feel it necessary to clarify just why exactly Wish tops out on my list, even though Riley and I did a video for its 25th anniversary 2 years ago, which you totally should watch because it's a good video. That video was still a while ago, and because within the canon of The Cure, while most certainly beloved and containing debatably the most popular Cure hit, the inescapable Friday I'm in Love, and my cat is about to jump down. Thanks, Stevie. Anyway, Wish is a very well-liked album that, nonetheless, isn't exactly a record you see many people champion as their peak. However, I have to get on my pedestal and say that this record contains the highs of records like Pornography and Disintegration, none of the potential bloat of albums like Kiss Me, and the taut intentionality of records like Faith. While this does run over an hour, it's an immensely balanced hour that flows back and forth between morose ballads, manic experiments, and songs that exist in a multi-dimensional liminality that I think is positively essential to understanding what makes The Cure's music and Robert Smith's songwriting great. Where Disintegration is a thorough exploration of depression, loneliness, and heartbreak, and wallowing of the emotions therein, Wish gives you that and then also shows you the other side of the coin. I feel like this coming right after their often heralded masterwork is no accident, as it's a fleshing out of very similar ideas. But there's less attention paid to consistency and more attention being paid to a full, emotional portrait of living with manic emotions. How else are you going to get an album with bright, irreverent detours like Wendy Time and Friday I'm in Love, alongside cuts like the classic A Letter to Elise or the dirgy, ruinous To Wish Impossible Things? Songs that revel in the utter futility inherent with love while the protagonist still explores the issue in the present tense as opposed to reflecting on a lovelorn past like they had before. There's more agency within Wish, and thus I find it a bit more of a mature record. It means it has far more limited appeal, granted, but within that comes refinement that I greatly appreciate when it comes to balancing this experience into the best version of itself. While not far away from their gothic jangle pop and post-punk stylings, I have to say this is by some measure my favorite sounding Cure record as well. The blurry, psychedelia-tinged guitar tones are just some of my favorite in all of music, and the craftsmanship on display is genuinely commendable. The great thing about the remaster of this album is that the most recent version does feel as though the production lets the instrumentation breathe a little more. There's more space, but personally, I actually like the quasi-suffocating feel of a more dense mix. To me, it just suits the vibe better. But if you find yourself not gelling with this one, like Tom Waits' Real Gone, I'd encourage a listen to the other version because while I wouldn't call Wish an underrated album, it threatens to be eclipsed by the monumental work that came before it, as well as dealing with a new lineup change that had mixed results for the band as a whole. So while it's a shame it's not quite as revered as the band's other classics, it's easy to see why this one is relatively left behind. With an astonishing blend of deep cuts, powerhouse singles, intoxicating production, and Smith's best and most nuanced writing, in my opinion, Wish is the ultimate graceful raison d'etre of The Cure to me. I think that the music of The Cure is important to me and many others because it's a gentle reminder that not everything will lose its luster. All these years later, almost a full decade of having their music in my life, and still it resonates with me. Sometimes you outgrow artists, and honestly, that's probably a good thing. It means that you've grown, you've evolved, you've changed. However, there is something truly magical about a band that are so multifaceted and multidimensional that they can speak to both the youth and those who are more over the hill. There are a lot of things I once loved that I do feel like have lost the magic a little bit as I get older. But not The Cure. It's why it's been so nice seeing so many people come together for the long-awaited Songs of a Lost World. I've seen so many people saying they've been fans since the 80s, and now they're coming back, as enchanted by this music as they've ever been. And even people I know who are in their 20s, born long past their peak, both critically and commercially, and they're all just as stoked too. It's reassuring to see it unite so many people in shared appreciation. I think we can all glean that times are tough when so many people are just chomping at the bit to have some bit of cathartic melancholy that's always going to be tied to their music. That said, we could all use a little something to bond over right now. So please, if you have any stories, associated memories, thoughts, and opinions on this band, please tell us in the comments below. We read everything, and we're always encouraged to keep doing what we're doing when we're lucky enough to get feedback. Until next time, folks, I'm Jake from the Jams and Tea Podcast, signing off, and hopefully I will see you soon when we talk about The Cure's Songs of a Lost World.